Should be taking notes on this. I'm also recording these things, and I'll be putting the PowerPoint slides available so you guys can review them. Okay? So we left off with the four major periods that make up that region of Mesopotamia, the general area of the Fertile Crescent. So this is a quick map of Sumeria Babylon. Now remember, we're looking at four different time periods, okay? And so what you're going to find is that at different times throughout the evolution of these cultures that it sort of migrates from one area or develops into a different area. So this is a map during the time of King Hammurabi, and I probably pronounced that wrong. I had a person last term that knew exactly how to pronounce it, and I already forgot how to pronounce it. How many of you guys have heard of King Hammurabi? No? Some of you have. So two of you have? Okay. All right. All right. What I want you guys to note, right, comparing this to the overall region, is that this stuff is relatively close to the Persian Gulf. This is an overall map that you see over here. I'll use my cursor to kind of point to it, right? And here are those 5 bodies of water that I mentioned earlier, right? The Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the top of the Red Sea. And so it becomes important that you use those as a way of kind of understanding the location of things. Okay? And that's why it's so important for you guys to do that cognitive mapping. All right, so moving forward into this period, right, it evolved into a civilization somewhere between 4,000 and 3,500 BCE. Okay, around that time period, the villages that were in the Tigris-Euphrates valleys were growing sufficiently to where they were starting to become cities. Right, there was already a ruling class established in there, and they started to kind of develop things that would create a civilization. So this group of people, the Sumerians and the Babylons, they focused, or their culture specialized in a few things. So agriculture, obviously, that's where they made their food, right? Or they grew their food. There was this idea of pottery making that really comes from the availability of something like clay. All right. Then there was a sort of an industry that evolved around weaving and cloth making. All right. And what's important is that those things you're going to see kind of evolve into their art forms and into their architecture. So one of the things that's important to note about these early Sumerian Babylonian people is that they developed mathematics, astrology, and I did say astrology, I didn't say astronomy, right? Sciences that were more advanced than those of Egypt. Okay, and they did it before them. So that's an important distinction. We kind of think of Egypt as being, this superpower at the time, right? But the reality is that there were people that were more advanced than them, right? Very close to where they were. So one of the things that they mastered was hydraulics, drainage, and irrigation. Why do you think that is? Anybody want to take a guess at that? What? Agriculture. That's one thing. Definitely need to water fields, right? And the fact that they were in a river valley, those are important features, correct? So now think about it. When you guys irrigate your landscape, there's a little electronic box that says, I've got to 9 o'clock in the morning. I think I'll tell that valve controller over there to turn on. So it sends a low voltage signal to a solenoid, right? And it's got the ability to open a valve and water an area. And it runs through pipes, and then it shuts off after a while. These people didn't have sprinkler systems. So they irrigated by flooding fields. So they had to basically be able to open up a gate manually and let the water flow from the river into the field, flood it to a certain depth, close the gate, right? And then the water would percolate back down into the soil. One other thing that's really important, and I may talk about it in a future slide, but one of the strange things about Tigris and Euphrates River Valley is that the rivers are actually a little bit higher than the surrounding ground around them. Sounds weird, huh? But essentially, as the river in its lower states would deposit silts along its banks, that would build up, right? And that would create kind of almost like two levees or mounds to either side. So now what do you think happens when you get a massive flood? Well, it overflows those banks and floods for miles and miles and miles. So that's part of what made this area so unstable. Much more unstable than the Nile, and very unpredictable. Okay? Continuing on, one of the key things that helped the Sumerians to develop a culture is that they developed the oldest form of writing that I believe modern man is aware of. It was called cuneiform. And a lot of it was developed around their sort of mercantile business and having to kind of keep track of things. So it looks like a bunch of like slashes and stuff, almost like we might do 1, 2, 3, 4 and put a diagonal. It sort of looks sort of like that. The ones that I've seen. With the writing came the ability to start to record history. So think about that. Think about what we studied last week. It was prehistoric versus a culture that is actually recording their history. Who was the king? Was there a big flood that year? Did the God descend from heaven and bestow upon us gifts? So they had that as one of the things that distinguished their culture from what was going on in other places. Okay? Understand that this predates what was going on at Stonehenge by a long, long time. Right? So there were probably still cave people running around over there. I'm saying that in a sort of tongue-in-cheek, ha-ha sort of way. The reason I asked about you guys knowing who Hammurabi was is because Hammurabi was credited with developing the first known body of laws. How many of you guys have ever heard the phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? That's who developed that phrase. Okay? It was part of his laws. The Sumerian region was predominantly focused on the elements of our environment, which are the sky, the sun, the earth, the moon, and water. Okay? And those are the things that would eventually be sort of conferred into the divine. And that's an important thing to understand, is this notion of the creation of a divinity. And then what you got to realize is that there was this linkage to a ruling class. The ruling class either were the divinity or they were in contact with the divinity. Okay? The city of Babylon, which I just previously showed you, let me see if I can back up here. Or maybe not. Yeah, there it is, right there. Okay? Became the capital, all right, right there, around 2000 BCE. Okay? I forgot the E at the end of that. So, I don't think I have in these PowerPoints like timelines, but I'm going to try and develop some of those because I think they kind of help you guys to see things relative to each other. Okay? All right. Going on to the next slide. So the primary building material for these people was mud brick. Okay? Just regular old mud brick. So now let me explain to you what mud brick is. That is, you go down by the riverbank and you grab some silty mud and you put it in a little box right up on the riverbank and you let it dry out and get hard. Right? That is not the same as a brick. A brick is fired. It's made of clay, not mud, and it is fired and made harder. If I take a brick and I put it in a bucket of water, right, it's not going to dissolve. It's going to absorb water because it is porous, but it's not going to dissolve. If I take a mud brick and I put it in water, you're going to end up with a bunch of dirt down at the bottom of it. And that's the difference between fired clay and unfired clay. My daughter graduated from USC Architecture a year and a half ago. And the last semester that she was at USC Architecture, she took a really interesting class. They got to use the big KUKA robot, the thing that they use to make cars and stuff. And her teacher had made this thing that would squirt out like toothpaste. It would squirt out clay. And so she designed this bizarre organic form, and then created a file out of it that sent it to the KUKA robot. And the KUKA robot went out and went, and it just basically laid this thing up, right? And Marta, she took pictures of it. It was really beautiful. It was just amazing to look at the thing. And her teacher said, "Oh, well, leave it there. I will fire it later this evening." Well, he forgot to. And that weekend it rained. So Marta came back to see that she had a little pile of clay. Not much, because a lot of it had washed away. All right? And so that's an important distinction. Mud brick is structurally really weak. Okay? So you guys have all picked up a dirt clod at some point and broken it or crumbled it or something? Or you maybe have dug and broke up a clod of dirt? That's all that it is. All right? So if it's really weak, one of the things you can do to compensate for something being really weak is to use more of it. So you might not be able to take a mud brick wall that's this wide, say the distance of 2 of my hands, right? To use what we were talking about earlier. You might not be able to use mud bricks that are the size of 2 of your hands to build a 20-foot high wall. But if you use something that was from fingertip to fingertip, you might be able to create a 20-foot high wall, right? And so, again, that led to the creation of these massive, massive walls. One of the things about massive walls is that they serve as thermal insulators, okay? They have thermal mass, and so in hot areas, the hot air that's around it gets absorbed into the brick. Any of you ever been in a cave? None? A few of you have. So I remember, not this past year, but the year before, we took the students on this really long trip, and we went to a place called Antelope Canyon. Antelope Canyon is fantastic. If you ever get a chance to go there, go. It's beautiful. It's these swirling gold, red, and sort of umber-colored organic shapes, and you're down in this cavern, and the sun's coming through. It's magical. But it was really interesting to go there and walk from up above where it was kind of hot in the sunshine and go descend down into this sort of slot canyon that you walk through, and how much cooler it was down below. Okay? Well, as a function of making the thick walls, they started to notice that these places stayed cooler. So one of the characteristics of mud brick structures is that they can't span very far. So like this room, there's nothing from that wall to that wall. There's nothing, right? And if we wanted to have glass across that whole edge, we do have glass across that whole edge, right? We span long distances in our modern era. Back then, they couldn't. Mud brick wouldn't span very far. It would just crumble and fall in. And so the function of that was that the openings in the walls were fairly narrow and small. There was very little timber in the region, all right? And so the timber that they did get was predominantly used for the spanning structure of the roof. All right? They couldn't go down to Lowe's or Home Depot and pick up a 2 by 12 by 16 or something. They didn't have that option. All right. So some of the problems that are related to this idea of building with mud, right, is that you can picture it might be kind of ugly, right? It's like brown and kind of bloppy and so it was not very attractive, and every time it rained, your house melted, right? That kind of sucked, right? You go home, oh man, I got to rebuild the thing. It just melted. It rained. Okay, so they solved this problem in 2 ways, okay? One was they used a material, I believe came from plants, that was a whitewashing, right? And that kind of created a seal over the mud brick. So that was one option. And then another one was by patterning the outside of it with these cones that were made of clay and were fired and were colored. Okay? So here I have a picture of these cones. It's called cone mosaic. These are actual pieces that are in a museum somewhere.